So we're continuing in our Summer of Love series, and of course we're looking at the love passages in 1 John. And so just want to kind of catch us up so we're all on the same page, just so everybody knows where we're at, right? We started out in week 1, and we were talking about these themes that John uses with light and darkness and love and hate. And of course, light seems to refer to love and darkness to hate. And so the idea that John lays very early on for us is that if we claim to be in the light, then it's evidenced by how we love one another. And if we are walking in darkness, it's evidence for the hate that we have toward the people who God puts around us. And then next week, or the week 2, we talked about learning to love and just really unpacking what the word love means, right? That we use that in a variety of contexts, but we don't always mean it the same way. Like, I love my family, I love Chicago Cubs baseball, but I certainly don't love those two the same, right? If the Cubs win another World Series, I may love them more. I don't know. We'll see. No, I'm just teasing. But we talked about how we use that word love, and we just throw it around in ways that, sometimes cause more difficulty than it does to actually clarify things. And then last week, we talked about not loving the world, about being in the world but not loving the things of the world. And so this week, we're moving on to 1 John chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and open to that. And you can use a pew Bible in front of you, or a device on your phone, or you can just follow along on the screen, however you want to do that. But before we actually get to any scripture, I want to tell you 2 important truths that I have uncovered this week. And I want to unpack each of these a little bit before we actually move into the text. But the first truth that I have come to see in my life, and the more I read and understand Scripture, the more I think this is true, is that what we sacrifice reveals the content of our heart. Now, let me pause there for just a minute and give you a silly illustration that might explain this truth. A few years ago, Tim and I were talking about going to Alaska together to backpack and pack raft and to do all kinds of stuff. And man, I was making miles, knocking out 20 miles on a Friday on my day off, and then hiking with Emily on Saturday. And I was just getting prepped and ready for that. And then COVID hit and didn't go, right? And then the next year, we were going to try it again. Still some COVID restrictions, so didn't go. And so here it is now, several years later, and more importantly, several pounds later, and I'm sitting here going, I couldn't do that trip if I wanted to right now, right? I am too out of shape. Now, here's what I'm getting at, though. In my mind, I want to do it. I want to be healthier. I need to get rid of all this COVID. I'm just calling it COVID weight, right? I need to get rid of all of that. And it needs to be gone, because I'm telling myself I want to go backpack more. I want to be more adventurous. I want to do the kinds of things that I did years ago that really just brought life to me. I want to be on my mountain bike going up and down the hills. I want to, to be on my kayak and out in the water. And I want to do those kinds of things. But there's not a shred of evidence in my life to suggest that that's true. Other than what I tell myself, right? Because I'm still going to go by McDonald's and grab lunch. I'm still going to sleep too late and not get up early to go to the gym. I'm still going to do the kinds of stuff that really knock the reality of that kind of stuff out of my life. I'll give mental assent to it, but there's nothing really in my life to suggest that that's true. And the reason it's not true is because I know I'm not sacrificing to make those things a reality in my life. Right? I'm just not doing it. And so we could say that that's true in a physical sense. We could also say it's true in a financial sense too, right? Like maybe, I look at my life and I say, man, I'm almost 50. I got to be thinking about retirement and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm trying to process all of that. And I think, well, I need to be more financially responsible, right? And because I need to start planning better and prepping better and kind of moving toward that last stage of life and all that stuff. But again, there's nothing to suggest that that's true in my life, because I'm not doing the kind of things that I need to do, that my mind is telling me I need to do. I'm not doing it. There's no sacrifice. And so that's not really the content of my heart then, right? Because I'm sacrificing for just personal pleasure. I'm sacrificing for fun. I'm sacrificing for, it feels good to sit on the couch and not go do this. And so that reveals what's really in my heart is just the idea that I just want to be lazy, right? I just want to be selfish. I don't want to put myself out and do those kinds of things anymore. And so that's a really important truth that I've come to learn. And hopefully you resonate with that in some idea that, hey, I think that's true for me too, right? Maybe not in the way that I just mentioned it for me, but maybe there's some things in your life that you're telling yourself they are important and they matter, but yet you look at what your life choices are and there's no sacrifice to suggest that those things are true. And so that's the important truth number one. Here's a second one that I want you to see as well. That we are willing to sacrifice others on the altar of religion rather than change. Now, I'm 20 plus years in to ministry. And I don't know if I've ever written a more true statement in my life than the one that you see on the screen right there. Because I couldn't tell you how many churches say, you know what? We want to grow. But yet if you took a survey of how many people sitting in that church on Sunday actually invited someone to church with them this weekend, there's probably not a lot. I couldn't tell you how many churches I have seen who say, you know what? We want to grow, but don't you dare change the color of the carpet. We want to grow, but don't even think about moving a piece of sacred furniture or something in the building. Can't do that, but we want to grow. We want to grow, but we want to make sure that you're using the right Bible translation. Or we want to make sure that you're dressed in a certain way. Or we want to make sure that all of these things are happening that we can control, but yet we want to grow. And what we end up doing is sacrificing others on the altar of religion rather than us actually changing. We say we want to grow, but there's no evidence to suggest that we're willing to sacrifice our personal preference to make that growth happen. Let's take it from a church perspective to an individual perspective. We may look at our lives and say, you know what? I really need to change my life. I want to be closer to Jesus. And so therefore, I know to be closer to Jesus, I really need to work on how I love other people. And then 3 seconds later, I'm on my social media posting something that robs other people of the image and the glory of God that is in them as much as it is me. I want to change and grow, but there's nothing in my personal life to suggest that I'm willing to sacrifice for it. I may say that I want to grow and be more like Jesus, and I know part of that is prayer. And I want to be like Jesus. Am I going to get up and pray early in the morning? Nope, not going to do that. Am I going to pray at night? Nope, I'm not going to do that either. But I want to be like Jesus, but there's no sacrifice in my life to suggest that's really true. Those are two important truths that we need to understand as we get into John chapter 3, because John chapter 3 is going to call us out on both of those. And it's going to do that by talking about an old story in the Bible, one of the oldest stories. And then John's going to spin that, and he's going to use that story to springboard into our lives as well. And so just remember that these two truths are in my life and probably in yours. And that's why they're almost universal in the sense that John could use them 2,000 years ago to talk about something that we can still understand today. And so in John chapter 3, let's take a look at verse 11. And we're just going to look at 2 verses here. So John says, "For this is the message that you've heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." Now this is nothing new, right? John said this in the letter a few times. And so you know from if you've tuned in over the last couple of weeks, that love is not just an affectionate feeling towards someone. If you remember how we defined it in week 2, that love was a radical commitment to come alongside of somebody else, to encourage them or to help them be the person God has created them to be. And so in other words, if I say that I love you, it's not just that I feel an affection towards you. It's the fact that I am in your life and you are in my life in such a way that together we are both becoming the people God wants us to be. And so that's at the heart of what John says when he says that you've heard this message from the beginning to love one another. These were the words of Jesus when he was here for 3 years preaching and teaching and walking and talking and doing the stuff that Jesus did. John takes the whole life of Jesus and he sums it up just in this one idea of love one another. But it's not just John's idea, because Jesus did the same thing, right? That here's the greatest command, to love one another. And all the law and the prophets are fulfilled when you do that. And so that's the first thing that John says. But look at the next verse. Here's where it gets weird. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. Now, doesn't that seem different or difficult or weird to kind of pull that story out and to drop it right here? Like, John's talking about love. He's the apostle of love. He's the one who was known for preaching one-sentence sermons. Little children, love one another. Hey, don't worry about anything else. If you get that right, you've done enough, right? That's John's message. And now all of a sudden, he goes back into Israel's history and he pulls out this story about Cain and Abel, and he drops it right here in the middle of the text. He doesn't give us any backstory about the story. So some of you may not know the story of Cain and Abel. So let me unpack that for just a little bit, because you need to understand it so that we can understand what John is saying here. So in the story of Cain and Abel, it's Genesis chapter 4. And if you have a text and you want to look at that, I'm not going to read the whole story. I'm just going to skim a few parts of it. But in Genesis chapter 4, we know that Adam and Eve have already been placed outside of the garden, right? That they have rebelled against God. And because they have rebelled against God, God has now brought curse upon the serpent. And the serpent no longer is able to do what he was doing. He's got to crawl on his belly and eat of the dust all the days of his life. And then Adam is going to have to work the ground, and it's going to be hard. Instead of life being easy, the ground's going to produce thorns and thistles. And now Eve is in a relationship with her husband, and there's going to be a power struggle between the two, that her desire will be for her husband, but he is going to lord over her. And let me pause here for just a second and say that disproportional power structures in relationships are part of the fall. They're not God's plan for your marriage or for how the church ought to be. Now, we can move on. That's not part of the sermon. So here in Genesis chapter 4 then, they have been removed from the garden, and it appears to be that they want back in. And they're coming back to the door, to the gate of the garden, and God is there, but God also warns them in Genesis chapter 4 that someone else is there too. He says that sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. There's this personification of sin in Genesis chapter 4. That its desire is for us. And the picture that Genesis gives us is that it's like a coiled serpent ready to strike. That should sound familiar with the imagery that was in Genesis 3 of the serpent, right? And so its desire is there, and it is for us. Now, look at the next part of this verse on the screen before we unpack the rest of Genesis 4. No, back up, Joe. And why? Oh, no. Let me say this part, and then we'll finish. Sorry, I'm about to put the cart ahead of the horse. And so here in Genesis chapter 4, then, they're outside of the garden, and they're in this space where they seem to be trying to get back in. And in this space over here, there's now tension that exists in relationships. And there are two brothers who are the sons of Adam and Eve, and their names are Cain and Abel. And they seem to be bringing sacrifice, bringing offering to God in an effort to move back into this right relationship with God that was lost in Genesis chapter 3. And so we're not told why, but Cain and Abel both bring an offering to God, and God accepts Abel's sacrifice, but he's not pleased with Cain's sacrifice. And I've heard a lot of people wax eloquently on why God would pick one or the other. You can read the story, and if you figure it out, let me know, because it's not in the text. We're just told that God preferred one over the other. And so Cain is so upset that his brother's sacrifice was accepted and his was not, that later in the story, in verse 8, Cain spoke to his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. He kills his brother. God shows up and asks Cain what he has done. And he says, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Where is Cain?" Where is Abel? And Cain responds, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And from that point, God puts a mark on Cain, and Cain becomes known as a wanderer in the text. That he's a man without a place, without a home. He wanders. And so that's kind of always been Israel's existence. A Cain-style existence of wandering in the wilderness. Now, back in the story, look at what it says next here. It says, "And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil, and his brother's deeds were righteous." And so John interprets why Cain kills his brother. Now, I want to share one thing with you that I think is absolutely fascinating. You see that word that I highlighted in yellow there in the second sentence, the word murder? So you all know me enough by now to know I am a complete word geek when it comes to stuff in the text. And so I'm looking through, I've got all of my lexical aids pulled out, and I'm checking different things. And I find out that in some translator notes, just one simple thing says, this is not the Greek word for murder here, it's the Greek word for butcher. But that doesn't make sense, right? To say that Cain butchered his brother. All of us think that Cain hit Abel in the head with a rock, right? It's not in the text, by the way, but if we were to imagine it, that's the way we typically imagine it, right? So we're not told how he did it, but here's what it says. That literally, John says that Cain butchered his brother Abel. And then me being a complete Bible geek, for lack of a better word, I'm starting to look up, well, where else does this word show up? This butcher. And it shows up in reference to Levitical priests making Old Testament sacrifice. That when they would kill an animal, they would butcher it. Because we know how the sacrificial rites worked in the Old Testament, right? They butchered the animal. They didn't waste the good meat. They burnt the entrails and offered that as a sacrifice. And then the priests would eat, and they would divide up the good meat and eat it. And so here's at the heart then of what John is telling us happened in this story. Is that these two brothers, Cain and Abel, make an offering and a sacrifice to God, and they bring that to God. God looks at both. He accepts one and not the other. Cain's mad. And in the story of Genesis 4, God knows Cain's angry, and he says, Cain, if you'll just do what is right, you'll be accepted. And so Cain's response to that is not to actually change himself. His response to that is to say, God, you rejected my sacrifice. Let me give you another one. How about I sacrifice my brother on the altar of my religion and I bring that to you? See how that works out. And so in his anger, he sacrifices his brother. He murders his brother in his religious anger. And a lot of us are guilty of the same things. We're not walking around sacrificing people in the same way that Cain did. But John takes this story and he says, you know what you do when you have hate in your heart toward another brother? You're guilty of the same thing. That when God is asking us to change, when God is asking us to sacrifice, when God is asking us to be in the world in a particular way, and we say, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm willing to sacrifice my own brother so I can do what I want to do. And God, you should have accepted what I offered. And because you didn't, I'll give you this instead. That's the first story that that John tells about Cain. And he's getting ready to tell us another story. And what we see in this next story, though, is that there's a better way to be in the world. What if we were willing to sacrifice ourselves in order to truly change? I think that's the message that John is driving at when we look at this next set of verses. Look at verse 16. He says, by this we know love, that he, meaning Jesus, laid down his life for us. And look at that. What does it say? And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. That we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. Do you see the distinction that John's making here? That in the Cain story, it's God, I am going to do things my way. I am not going to change. You will accept my sacrifice, or I'm not going to give you anything. Because this is my world and it's the way I want it to be. And I am willing to sacrifice my brother to have things the way I want them to be. And then John flips that on its head and he says there's another story that should be told. And the story is not that you're willing to sacrifice your brother, but that you are willing to lay your life down for the sake of that brother. That because that brother is created in the image of God, because that brother or sister is created to be in this world in a particular way, that you ought to be willing to sacrifice your pride, your preference, your arrogance, whatever it is, that you should be willing to put that stuff to death so that you can love your brother. Do you see the story that he's telling? And how he paints these things to be in opposition to each other, that we ought not be this way, but we ought to be this way in the world. Look at what he says next, because I want to make a distinction that he's not talking about us laying down our lives physically, although it may come to that, and if it does, the pattern of Jesus still applies. But look at what he says next. He says, but if anyone has the world's goods, and he sees his brother in need and yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Ooh. That's tough. And it goes back to the question of, are we willing to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of someone else? I want to share a story with you that I heard some years ago. And it was about a new father, and his first baby. His wife had just had one, their first child, and as typical with the first child, you don't know how to respond when things go wrong, right? And this particular child was colicky and would cry all the time. And I don't know if you've gone through that experience. But when you have a baby who just won't stop crying, it's enough to cause you to have a break with reality after several hours. And so this just went on night after night after night. And the dad would get up and he would put the baby in a car seat and drive the baby around town until hopefully the baby would fall asleep. And so one night, though, it didn't work, and the baby just kept crying and crying and crying. And he said, we're going to have to take this child to the hospital. Something is wrong. And so he gets close to the hospital, pulls up in the parking lot, and the baby is sound asleep. And he said in that moment, he looks back in the car seat at the baby, and he said, that child is going to be the death of me. And he said, in that moment, God just revealed to him his heart. And he said, you're exactly right. Because you need to learn to die to self so that you can be in the life of another person in the way that he or she needs you to be. And so I wonder for us, how many things are going on in our lives that we are just frustrated and aggravated about? And there seems to be no resolution. And I wonder if sometimes we're not living this Cain-style existence where we're just bringing our sacrifice to God. We don't even know what God wants. We're just bringing it. God, you should take this. You should take this. You should take this. And God's saying, it's not what I want. Just change and bring me the sacrifice that I want. No, God, here's this sacrifice. Here's this sacrifice. And we're frustrated and we're angry and we're upset. I wonder how many times our lives could be radically transformed if we just simply said, you know what? I need to die to that way of existence. And instead of me trying to impose my will on God and being willing to sacrifice my brother on the altar of the way I think things ought to be, what if I simply just made the choice to die to self? And say, okay, God, if this is the way you want it, I'm willing. It's a tough story. But John paints this, I think, so that we can make these two distinctions. That over here, Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And then over on this side of the story, John says, yes, you are. You ought to be willing to lay down your life for your brother, not take his life. So I don't know where any of this lands with you this morning, but I know for me it's been a really tough and difficult week to kind of work through some of this stuff. Because I tend to live a Cain-style existence where I am just trying to impose my will upon God at all costs, rather than just being willing to simply lay down my life for the sake of Christ and the sake of others.